The dog didn't bark. He grabbed the diaper. And in that quiet, ordinary backyard, a life changed forever. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across the wooden fence of the Brooks family home in Cedar Falls, Montana, the kind of soft golden light that makes everything look peaceful even when danger is only a few steps away. The grass was still damp from the morning sprinkler, and a faint breeze carried the scent of lake water from the edge of the property where the yard sloped gently toward a narrow shoreline. Daniel Brooks stood inside the kitchen rinsing a coffee mug, the steady hum of the faucet mixing with the distant laughter of his 2-year-old son outside. Daniel was 36, a former United States Marine whose life once moved to the rhythm of patrol routes and radio commands. These days his battlefield was quieter. A backyard, a wooden deck, the small sounds of family life. And somewhere beyond the sliding glass door, his son Noah waddled across the grass with the determined curiosity only toddlers seem to possess. Noah wore a bright blue t-shirt and a diaper that sagged slightly with the weight of afternoon play. Every few steps he stopped, bending down to examine a rock or a patch of clover, as if each one might hold the secret of the universe. Watching him from only a few feet away was Max. Max was a golden retriever with a broad chest, soft amber eyes, and the patient posture of a creature that believed watching over people was simply part of living. Daniel had adopted him from a crowded shelter a year earlier, a quiet dog with calm instincts and a gaze that seemed to understand more than it should. Since Noah learned to walk, Max had rarely been more than a few feet from the boy. Not out of command, not out of training, just something older than words. The yard itself looked harmless enough. A swing set stood near the fence. A wooden bench rested beneath a cottonwood tree. But beyond the gentle slope of grass lay a narrow lakeshore where the ground, softened by weeks of spring rain, had begun to loosen along the edge. The water below was deep and still, reflecting the pale Montana sky like a sheet of glass. Inside the kitchen, Daniel dried his hands and glanced through the window, the instinct of a Marine, never fully leaving him even in peaceful moments. Outside, Noah had begun wandering closer to the far side of the yard, small steps carrying him toward the gentle downward slope leading to the lake. Max followed silently, head slightly lowered, ears twitching as the wind brushed through the cottonwood leaves. The breeze shifted again. It carried the scent of wet soil and something else beneath it, something unstable, the faint crumble of earth where grass roots no longer held the shoreline together. Noah giggled at something only he could see and kept walking. Another step, then another. Max's posture changed. His body stiffened, muscles tightening beneath his golden coat as his eyes locked onto the small figure ahead. The distance between the boy and the shoreline had shrunk to only a few feet now, the ground sloping more steeply with each step. The lake water shimmered quietly beyond the grass, peaceful and silent. From inside the house, Daniel reached for a dish towel, unaware that outside, time had begun to narrow into seconds. Noah lifted one small foot and stepped closer to the edge. And that was when Max moved. Max did not hesitate. The moment Noah lifted his foot toward the soft slope near the water, the golden retriever lunged forward with a sudden burst of motion that seemed far too fast for such a calm dog. His paws pressed hard into the damp grass, claws digging for traction as he reached the toddler, just as the boy leaned forward with the innocent balance of a child who had not yet learned where the ground ended. Max lowered his head and gently clamped his teeth around the thick edge of Noah's diaper, not harshly, not with panic, but with the firm certainty of an animal that knew exactly what he was doing. The sudden pull surprised Noah, and his small body rocked backward onto the grass with a soft thump. The toddler blinked in confusion, his tiny hands pressing against the ground while Max held the fabric firmly, refusing to let go. For a moment, everything seemed still again. The lake shimmered quietly beyond them, the cottonwood leaves rustled overhead, and the distant sound of a truck passing on the country road drifted across the warm Montana air. Noah looked back at Max with wide eyes and gave a confused little laugh, as though the entire moment was just another game invented by his furry companion. Max did not laugh. His body remained tense, muscles tight, ears forward, eyes locked on the ground just beyond where Noah had been standing seconds earlier. Inside the house, Daniel Brooks stepped toward the sliding door, drying his hands slowly on the towel as he glanced outside again. At first, he only noticed Max crouched near Noah. Then he saw the dog holding the diaper. Daniel frowned slightly, not yet understanding what he was seeing. Outside, the breeze shifted once more, and a faint sound followed it. A soft cracking noise, barely louder than the snap of a twig. Max's ears twitched instantly. His grip tightened slightly, pulling Noah another few inches backward across the grass. The toddler protested with a small puzzled sound, kicking his feet in mild frustration, but Max did not release him. Then the ground moved. It was subtle at first, the outer edge of the slope settling just a fraction lower as damp soil loosened beneath the grass. The earth along the shoreline sagged, and then, with a quiet rolling crumble, a large section of the bank slid gently into the lake below. Water splashed upward in a dull echo that rippled across the still surface. A patch of grass that had looked solid only moments before vanished beneath the water. The lake swallowed it without a trace. Daniel froze at the doorway, the towel slipping from his hand as the scene outside suddenly made sense in a rush of cold realization. If Noah had taken one more step forward, the boy would have been standing exactly where the ground had just given way. The distance between where the toddler now sat and the collapsing shoreline was no more than 3 feet. Max slowly loosened his grip on the diaper, but did not move away. He simply sat beside the boy, chest rising and falling as he stared at the quiet water where the grass had disappeared. Noah, unaware of how close the moment had been, began patting Max on the head with cheerful curiosity. From the doorway, Daniel stepped forward into the yard, his heart pounding in his chest as the truth settled in with every step. The dog had not been playing. Max had been protecting him. Daniel Brooks stopped several feet from his son, his boots pressing into the damp grass as he stared at the quiet lake where the shoreline had collapsed only moments earlier. The water had already smoothed itself again, as if nothing unusual had happened, the surface reflecting the pale sky and the cottonwood branches swaying gently above. Yet the missing piece of land remained obvious now, a dark gap where green grass had once stretched toward the water. Daniel's breath slowed as the reality of the moment settled deep in his chest. For years he had trained himself to measure danger in seconds, to read small changes in a landscape the way other people read street signs. That instinct had once kept him alive overseas. But today it had not been his instinct that moved first. It had been Max. Noah giggled softly and wrapped both arms around the golden retriever's neck, the simple affection of a toddler who believed every moment of life was meant for laughter. Max remained still, accepting the hug with patient calm, his amber eyes drifting briefly toward Daniel before returning to the lake's edge. Daniel crouched slowly beside them, the grass cool beneath his knee. He reached out and placed one steady hand on Noah's shoulder, gently checking that the boy was safe, solid, and very much present in front of him. The child smiled up at him with the open joy that only 2-year-olds possess, completely unaware of how close the afternoon had come to turning into something very different. Daniel exhaled quietly, then turned his gaze toward Max. The dog's breathing had already returned to normal. His tail rested lightly on the grass, moving only slightly with the breeze. There was no excitement in him now, no sign that he believed he had done anything remarkable. To Max, the moment had simply been another decision made in silence. Daniel reached forward and ran his hand slowly along the dog's neck, feeling the warmth of thick golden fur beneath his palm. The same dog he had first seen months earlier in a crowded county shelter 2 towns away. Daniel remembered that day clearly. It had been late winter, the kind of gray Montana afternoon when the sky seemed too low and the wind carried the smell of melting snow across empty parking lots. He had not planned on bringing home a dog. At that time Noah had only just learned to crawl, and life already felt full enough with sleepless nights and the quiet adjustments of civilian life after the Marine Corps. But when Daniel walked through the narrow aisles of the shelter, he noticed a calm golden retriever sitting quietly inside a kennel while other dogs barked and paced around him. The retriever did not bark at all. He simply watched Daniel with a steady gaze that carried an unusual patience. Daniel had crouched in front of the kennel and studied the dog for a long moment. There was something in those eyes he recognized immediately. Not fear, not excitement, awareness. The same quiet watchfulness Daniel had seen in fellow Marines who understood responsibility without needing it explained. A volunteer had opened the kennel door, and the dog had stepped forward slowly, tail low but hopeful. Daniel remembered kneeling there on the concrete floor, while the retriever gently pressed his nose against Daniel's hand, as if greeting an old friend rather than a stranger. That was the moment Daniel had decided to bring him home. Now, kneeling in the backyard months later with Noah laughing beside him and the lake stretching silently beyond the broken shoreline, Daniel realized that the calm dog from the shelter had already become something far more important than a simple family pet. Daniel remained kneeling in the grass for several seconds, his hand resting on Max's neck, while Noah continued to pat the dog with cheerful determination. The late afternoon air carried a quiet stillness now, broken only by the gentle ripple of lake water brushing against the new edge of the shoreline. From inside the house, Emily Brooks pushed open the sliding door and stepped onto the wooden deck, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel as she called toward the yard. Her voice carried the warm familiarity of someone who had spoken that same call 1,000 times before. She had been preparing dinner, unaware that the peaceful rhythm of the afternoon had shifted only moments earlier. When she stepped down from the deck and began walking across the lawn, she noticed Daniel crouched near the slope and Noah sitting beside Max. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The toddler was laughing softly, and the dog sat calmly beside him like he always did. But then Emily noticed the missing section of grass near the lake. She slowed her steps, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in the shape of the collapsed shoreline. The ground there had dropped away in a wide, uneven curve, exposing dark soil beneath the remaining grass. The lake water lapped quietly against the broken edge where solid ground had once been. Emily stopped several yards away and looked from the lake to Daniel, and then to Max. Daniel stood slowly, brushing his hands against his jeans before walking a few steps toward her. He did not speak right away. Instead, he glanced once more at the shoreline, and then back at their son, who was now trying to climb onto Max's back with playful determination. Emily read the expression on Daniel's face before he said a single word. Years of marriage had taught her how to understand the quiet signals in his posture. Something serious had happened. Daniel finally nodded toward the water and spoke in a calm voice that carried the steady tone he had used during his Marine Corps years. He explained how Noah had wandered toward the edge and how Max had suddenly grabbed the diaper and pulled the child backward just seconds before the ground gave way. Emily listened without interrupting, her eyes slowly moving back to the broken shoreline as the full meaning of the moment settled into place. The distance between where Noah had been walking and where the earth had collapsed could be measured in only a few feet, a few small steps, a few seconds of time. That was all that separated an ordinary afternoon from something that could have changed their lives forever. Emily placed one hand gently against her chest and exhaled slowly as she looked toward Max. The golden retriever sat patiently in the grass while Noah leaned against his side, completely unaware that the dog beside him had just made a decision that mattered more than the boy could possibly understand. Emily walked forward and crouched beside them, wrapping one arm around Noah while her other hand reached out to stroke Max's head. The dog responded with a slow wag of his tail, calm and content as if the moment required no recognition at all. Daniel watched the scene quietly, his eyes moving from his son to the dog and then to the lake again. The broken shoreline glistened under the soft evening light, a silent reminder of how fragile ordinary moments can be. For Daniel, the realization settled deep and clear. Max had not been trained for this. No command had been given. No whistle had sounded. The dog had simply seen the danger first and acted without hesitation. In Daniel's mind, the memory of that winter day at the shelter returned again, the calm dog sitting quietly behind the kennel door. At the time, Daniel had believed he was rescuing a dog. Standing there in the yard now, he understood something very different. The evening light slowly softened across the Brooks family yard as the sun drifted lower behind the cottonwood trees, casting long golden shadows across the grass and the quiet surface of the lake. Daniel stood beside Emily for a moment without speaking, both of them watching Noah wobble happily in the grass, while Max stayed close at his side like a quiet guardian. The toddler had already forgotten the entire moment, his attention now captured by a small yellow toy truck lying near the deck steps. He pushed the toy through the grass with determined focus, making soft humming sounds to himself, while Max followed with patient steps, never allowing more than a few feet of distance between them. Emily glanced once more toward the collapsed shoreline, where dark soil now sloped unevenly toward the water. The lake looked peaceful again, but the missing section of ground remained a silent reminder of what had nearly happened. She gently brushed a strand of hair behind her ear and looked at Daniel with a quiet seriousness in her expression. Daniel understood the look immediately. It was the same look they had shared many times during the past 2 years since Noah was born. The look that said something important had just changed inside their understanding of the world. Daniel finally walked back toward Noah and crouched down beside him again. The little boy looked up with bright eyes and lifted the toy truck proudly, as if showing off a great discovery. Daniel smiled softly and ruffled the boy's hair before glancing toward Max. The golden retriever sat calmly beside the child, his tail resting against the grass, his steady amber eyes scanning the yard the same way Daniel might scan a landscape during a patrol years ago. The similarity did not escape Daniel now. Max had chosen a position where he could watch both the child and the lake at the same time. It was a small detail, but Daniel noticed it immediately. Some instincts were not taught. They were simply part of who someone was. Emily slowly joined them and sat down in the grass as well, wrapping her arm around Noah while he continued to roll the toy truck through the clover. She reached out and gently scratched behind Max's ears. The dog leaned slightly into her hand with quiet appreciation, but kept his eyes on the open yard. For several minutes, none of them spoke. The only sounds were the breeze through the cottonwood leaves and the soft splashing of water against the new edge of the shoreline. Daniel eventually stood again and walked toward the lake, stopping several yards from the collapsed bank. He studied the ground carefully. The soil near the edge had clearly softened after days of rain. Beneath the surface, the earth had been slowly weakening until the weight of the grass and roots could no longer hold it together. It had been waiting for a small shift, a small step, a small moment of pressure. Daniel looked back toward the yard where Noah now laughed while Max gently nudged the toy truck with his nose, as if helping with the game. The realization settled deeper in Daniel's chest now. A difference of 2 or 3 seconds had separated this quiet evening from something no parent ever wants to imagine. And those seconds had belonged entirely to Max. The dog had seen the danger before anyone else understood it was there. Daniel turned his gaze toward the golden retriever again, and a quiet respect filled his expression. In the Marine Corps, Daniel had once served beside men who reacted to danger before anyone else recognized it. They were the ones who noticed the small changes in sound, movement, and tension in the air. The ones who acted first. Watching Max now, Daniel realized something remarkable. In his own quiet way, the dog had done exactly the same thing. The sky above Cedar Falls slowly shifted toward evening as the sun dipped lower behind the hills, painting the lake with long bands of orange and soft blue. The breeze cooled slightly, carrying the smell of fresh water and damp soil across the Brooks family yard. Noah had now discovered that his toy truck could roll faster on the wooden deck than it could in the grass, and he pushed it back and forth with delighted concentration while Max followed patiently beside him. Every time the small plastic wheels bumped against a board the toddler laughed, as if it were the most wonderful sound in the world. Emily sat on the bottom step watching them, her arms resting loosely on her knees while the quiet weight of the afternoon still lingered in her thoughts. Daniel returned from the lake edge and paused beside the deck railing, his eyes moving slowly across the yard again. The habit of scanning surroundings never really disappeared after years in the Marine Corps. Even in a peaceful place like this, his mind still measured distances, surfaces, and small details most people might overlook. Laid down beside the toddler, while the boy drove the toy truck over his back like a tiny road. Max did not move except to blink patiently at the slow rumble of plastic wheels across his fur. Emily smiled faintly at the sight, but her eyes carried a deeper gratitude now. Daniel rested his hands on the railing and looked across the yard once more. The quiet lake reflected the last light of the day, and the cottonwood branches rustled gently overhead. For a long moment, he simply stood there, watching the peaceful scene that now felt far more fragile than it had earlier that afternoon. In his mind, the moment replayed clearly. Noah stepping toward the slope. Max moving without hesitation. The ground collapsing seconds later. The sequence had been simple, almost silent, but its meaning was enormous. Daniel finally looked toward the golden retriever again, and a quiet respect returned to his expression. Some protectors wore uniforms. Some simply had 4 paws and watched carefully when no one else was looking. Evening settled gently over the Brooks property as the last light of the sun slipped behind the tall cottonwood trees, leaving the lake covered in a calm silver glow. The air cooled a few degrees, and the familiar sounds of the small Montana town began to drift across the distance. Somewhere down the road a pickup truck rolled past, its engine fading slowly as it followed the curve toward Cedar Falls. In the yard, Noah had grown tired of pushing the toy truck and now sat on the deck steps beside Max, leaning against the dog's warm side, as if it were the most natural seat in the world. Max remained perfectly still, the steady rhythm of his breathing rising and falling beneath the toddler's small shoulder. Daniel stood nearby with his arms folded loosely across his chest, watching them with quiet attention. Emily had returned inside briefly to check the oven, and through the kitchen window the soft yellow light of the house spilled across the deck boards. The peaceful scene looked like something from a family photograph, the kind of moment people remember years later without realizing how fragile it once was. Daniel walked slowly across the deck and sat down beside Noah, stretching his legs forward while the wooden boards creaked softly under his weight. Noah immediately lifted the toy truck and placed it in Daniel's hand, inviting him into the game with the simple trust that only a small child carries. Daniel rolled the truck gently across the deck toward Max, and the dog followed it with his eyes before nudging it back toward the boy with his nose. Noah burst into laughter again, delighted by the slow exchange. For a few minutes the three of them sat there quietly while the evening breeze moved through the trees above. Daniel glanced toward the lake once more. The dark outline of the collapsed shoreline was still visible even in the fading light, the uneven edge forming a silent curve along the water. It would need to be repaired eventually. He made a mental note to call a contractor in town who specialized in shoreline reinforcement. But for now the yard simply rested in quiet reflection. Emily stepped back outside carrying 3 glasses of lemonade and joined them on the deck. She handed one glass to Daniel and set the others on the step beside her before gently brushing Noah's hair back from his forehead. The child leaned comfortably against Max again, as if the dog had always belonged there beside him. Emily watched the two of them for a moment and then looked toward Daniel. Neither of them needed to repeat what had happened earlier that afternoon. The understanding remained clear between them. Some moments arrive quietly, but carry enormous meaning. Daniel took a slow sip of lemonade and looked down at Max. The golden retriever met his gaze briefly, then looked back toward the open yard and the distant water. The dog's calm attention had not changed. Even now he continued to watch the world with the same quiet awareness that had saved Noah only hours before. Daniel rested his hand on Max's shoulder and gently rubbed the thick fur beneath his fingers. The dog's tail moved once against the deck boards. It was a small gesture, almost unnoticed, but Daniel understood something important in that simple movement. Max did not see himself as a hero. He was simply doing what came naturally to him. Watching, protecting, staying close when it mattered most. The sky above Cedar Falls darkened slowly as the final colors of sunset faded into a deep blue twilight, and the first faint stars began to appear above the still surface of the lake. The Brooks family home glowed warmly. Behind the deck where Daniel, Emily, Noah, and Max remained together in the quiet comfort of the evening. The soft yellow light from the kitchen window stretched across the wooden boards, and the gentle hum of the refrigerator inside mixed with the distant chirping of crickets beginning their nightly song. Noah had grown sleepy from the excitement of the day and now rested quietly against Max with his small hand buried in the thick golden fur along the dog's shoulder. His eyelids drooped as he held the toy truck loosely in his other hand, the wheels barely turning when his fingers moved. Max did not shift even slightly. He sat with the calm patience of a guardian who understood that the little boy leaning against him trusted him completely. Daniel watched them both with the quiet reflection of a father whose thoughts had not yet settled after what had happened earlier. He leaned back slightly against the railing of the deck and listened to the peaceful sounds of the night settling across the property. The lake looked darker now, its smooth surface reflecting a narrow ribbon of moonlight that stretched across the water toward the shore. Somewhere across the lake a loon called once into the quiet air, its distant echo floating gently across the valley. Emily stepped inside the house briefly and returned with a small blanket that she wrapped gently around Noah's shoulders. The toddler barely stirred, his breathing already slow and steady with sleep. She sat beside Daniel and followed his gaze toward the dark outline of the lake beyond the yard. For a moment, they both remained silent, sharing the quiet understanding that sometimes the most important moments in life arrive without warning. Daniel finally spoke softly, almost more to himself than to anyone else. He said that during his years in the Marine Corps he had learned that survival often depended on noticing the smallest signals before anyone else did. A shift in sound, a change in movement, a feeling that something in the environment was not quite right. Those instincts had protected him more than once in places far from Montana. Emily listened quietly and then glanced down at Max, who still sat beside the sleeping child, as if guarding him from every unseen possibility. Daniel rested his hand gently on the dog's back and felt the calm strength in the animal's steady posture. He realized that Max had done exactly what the best protectors always did. He had noticed something before anyone else understood the danger was there. The dog had not hesitated. He had simply acted. Noah shifted slightly in his sleep and leaned closer into Max's side, the warmth of the dog's body comforting him in the cool night air. Max lowered his head slightly, remaining perfectly still so the child would not wake. Daniel watched the scene and felt a deep, quiet gratitude settle into his chest. Months earlier, he had believed he was rescuing a dog from a shelter kennel on a gray winter afternoon. Sitting there now beneath the Montana sky, he understood the truth more clearly than ever. Sometimes the ones we believe we are saving are quietly preparing to save us in return. The night deepened gently over the Brooks property as the moon climbed higher above the quiet Montana hills, casting a pale silver glow across the lake and the wide stretch of grass behind the house. The air had cooled enough that the scent of pine and fresh water drifted softly through the yard, and the steady rhythm of crickets filled the spaces between every quiet moment. On the wooden deck, Noah remained asleep beneath the small blanket Emily had wrapped around him, his head resting against Max, as if the dog had always been his natural pillow. The toy truck still sat loosely in his hand, tilted sideways on the deck boards. Max had not moved. His posture remained calm and steady, the quiet strength of his body rising and falling with each slow breath while he kept watch over the sleeping child. Daniel leaned forward slightly with his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze drifting once more toward the lake beyond the yard. In the moonlight, the collapsed section of shoreline looked even more dramatic than it had during the day. The dark soil created a shallow hollow along the water's edge where the earth had given way, and the gentle waves lapped quietly against it, as if smoothing the scar the land had left behind. Daniel measured the distance again in his mind, without thinking. Roughly 60 feet from the deck to the water. Less than 10 feet from where Noah had been standing to where the ground had fallen away. It was a calculation he could not stop replaying. Emily sat beside him and followed his gaze. She rested one hand gently on Noah's shoulder beneath the blanket, feeling the slow rise and fall of the child's breathing. After a moment, she spoke softly, saying that she had always believed their yard was one of the safest places their son could play. Daniel nodded slowly. It still was. But today had reminded him that safety was not always obvious. Sometimes danger arrived quietly and without warning, hidden beneath the ordinary parts of life that people trusted every day. He looked down again at Max. The golden retriever's ears twitched slightly at a distant sound somewhere beyond the trees, but the dog remained calm and settled beside the sleeping boy. Daniel thought again about the shelter where he had first seen Max sitting quietly behind the kennel gate. At the time, the decision to adopt him had felt simple, almost casual. The shelter volunteer had explained that Max had been found wandering near a highway outside a nearby town. No collar, no owner ever came forward. Daniel had not asked many questions after that. Something about the dog's steady eyes had already answered everything he needed to know. Now, watching the dog remain perfectly still so Noah could sleep peacefully against him, Daniel felt a quiet realization settle deeper in his thoughts. Max had not only joined their family. In a way, that afternoon had proven something more powerful. He had chosen to protect it. The moonlight reflected softly in the dog's amber eyes as he continued watching the quiet yard. The lake shimmered peacefully beyond the trees, and the night carried on without urgency or fear. Yet Daniel understood that one silent decision earlier that day had changed everything. The world often celebrated loud heroes, the kind who appeared in dramatic moments everyone could see. But sometimes the most important acts happened in silence. A watchful eye, a sudden movement, a gentle pull at exactly the right moment. And because of that quiet moment, Noah Brooks now slept peacefully beneath the Montana sky, while the dog who had saved him kept watch beside him. The night continued to settle quietly over Cedar Falls as the moon rose higher above the lake, casting a calm silver reflection across the still water. The Brooks family yard looked peaceful again, almost exactly the way it had looked before the afternoon had changed. Everything. The cottonwood branches swayed gently in the breeze, and the soft rustle of leaves blended with the distant sound of water touching the uneven edge of the shoreline. On the deck, Noah remained asleep beneath the blanket, his small body leaning comfortably against Max, as if the dog had always been part of his dreams. The toy truck had finally slipped from his hand and rested on the wooden boards near his feet. Max did not shift or stretch. He remained exactly where he had been for nearly an hour, sitting with patient stillness so the sleeping child could rest against him without being disturbed. Daniel watched the quiet scene from his chair near the railing, his mind slowly replaying the events of the afternoon with the careful attention he had once used to study mission briefings years earlier. Every detail seemed sharper now in memory. The slope of the grass, the brief movement of Max rushing forward, the sudden crumble of earth sliding into the lake. The entire sequence had taken only a few seconds, yet its meaning stretched far beyond that moment. Emily eventually stood and gently lifted Noah into her arms, careful not to wake him as she carried him inside toward his room. Max rose slowly from the deck and followed her to the door, watching quietly until she disappeared down the hallway. Only then did he return to the deck and sit beside Daniel again. The dog looked out across the yard with calm attention, his ears moving slightly as the distant sounds of the night carried across the valley. Daniel leaned forward and rested his hand on Max's shoulder. The golden retriever turned his head briefly, meeting Daniel's gaze with the same steady expression that had first caught his attention in the shelter kennel months earlier. Daniel smiled softly and shook his head in quiet amazement. He spoke aloud, even though the yard held only the two of them now. He said that back in the Marine Corps people used to talk about the importance of the one person on a team who noticed things first, the one who paid attention when others relaxed, the one who stepped forward before anyone else fully understood the danger. Max blinked slowly and rested his head against Daniel's knee as if he understood every word. Daniel looked across the lake once more and then back toward the warm light glowing through the windows of his home. Inside that house his son slept peacefully, completely unaware that a single silent decision earlier that day had protected his future in ways he might only understand years later. Daniel gently scratched behind Max's ears and exhaled slowly into the cool Montana night. Sometimes courage arrived with loud commands and flashing lights, but sometimes it arrived quietly on four steady paws, watching carefully, waiting patiently, and acting at exactly the moment it mattered most. The night air grew cooler as Daniel remained seated on the deck, the quiet of the Montana evening wrapping around the house like a soft blanket. The moon now stood high above the lake, bright enough to paint long pale reflections across the water and faint shadows across the yard. Max sat beside Daniel with the same calm patience he had shown all evening, his golden coat faintly silver in the moonlight. For a while neither of them moved. The house behind them glowed softly with warm light, and somewhere inside Emily gently closed Noah's bedroom door after laying him down for the night. The peaceful rhythm of the home slowly returned to normal, but Daniel knew that the day had quietly left a mark on all of them. He leaned back in his chair and looked across the yard again. The collapsed edge of the shoreline was still visible even in the dim light, a dark curve against the water where the earth had given way earlier that afternoon. It would be easy for most people to look at that spot and see nothing more than soil and grass. But Daniel saw something different now. He saw the exact place where a few seconds of instinct had changed the direction of a child's life. Max lifted his head slightly as if sensing Daniel's thoughts, his ears moving toward a distant sound somewhere near the tree line. After a moment he relaxed again and rested his chin near Daniel's boot. Daniel reached down and rubbed the dog's neck slowly, feeling the quiet strength beneath the thick fur. In the Marine Corps, Daniel had learned that trust was built through moments like this, not through speeches or promises, but through actions that proved someone would step forward when it mattered most. Max had done exactly that without being asked, without being trained for it, and without expecting anything in return. Daniel remembered again the day he had walked through the shelter rows during that gray winter afternoon. The memory felt clearer now than it had in months. He could still picture the narrow hallway lined with kennels and the sharp smell of disinfectant in the air. Most of the dogs had barked loudly as he passed, eager for attention, but Max had simply watched him with quiet patience. At the time, Daniel had thought the dog looked calm. Now he realized the word he should have used was aware. Max had been paying attention even then, the same way he had paid attention in the yard earlier that day. Daniel looked toward the house windows where warm light glowed through the curtains. Inside, Noah slept safely in his room, unaware of how close the afternoon had come to turning into something very different. The realization filled Daniel with a deep sense of gratitude that settled quietly in his chest. He scratched behind Max's ears once more and gave a small smile toward the dark lake beyond the yard. Some moments in life happened loudly, filled with noise and attention. But the most important ones often arrived quietly. A watchful dog, a careful eye, a gentle pull at exactly the right moment. Because of that moment, the Brooks family home remained peaceful beneath the Montana sky, and a little boy slept safely inside, while the dog who protected him kept silent watch beside the door. The quiet of the Montana night deepened as the hours passed, wrapping the Brooks family home in a calm that felt both ordinary and newly meaningful. Daniel eventually stood from the deck chair and stretched his arms slowly, the cool air brushing against his face as he took one last look across the yard. The lake lay still beneath the moonlight, its silver reflection stretching toward the shoreline where the broken edge of earth remained visible like a quiet reminder of the afternoon. Max rose beside him and walked calmly to the edge of the deck, pausing there as if continuing his silent watch over the yard. Daniel opened the sliding door and stepped inside, the warm air of the house replacing the cool breeze of the night. Max followed him in without hesitation, his paws moving quietly across the wooden floor as the door slid closed behind them. The house felt peaceful, in the way only a home with a sleeping child can feel. The hallway lights were dim, and the soft hum of appliances filled the background with a gentle rhythm. Emily stood near the kitchen counter pouring 2 cups of tea and looked up with a small smile when Daniel entered. Max walked slowly down the hallway toward Noah's room, stopping near the partially closed door and settling onto the floor just outside it, as if that spot had already become his natural post for the night. Daniel noticed the quiet decision and exchanged a knowing glance with Emily. Neither of them had asked the dog to stay there. He had simply chosen the place where he believed he was needed. Emily handed Daniel a warm mug and leaned gently against the counter while they both looked down the hallway toward the sleeping child's room. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The events of the day still echoed softly in their thoughts, but now those memories carried a quiet gratitude rather than fear. Daniel finally spoke in a calm voice and said that earlier in the afternoon he had measured the distance from the deck to the lake again. 60 feet of grass, 10 feet of unstable soil near the edge. Just a few small steps that could have changed everything. Emily nodded slowly, but her eyes rested on Max lying quietly in the hallway. The golden retriever had lowered his head onto his paws, but his ears remained alert, gently shifting at every small sound inside the house. Daniel took a sip of tea and felt the warmth settle into his chest. Over the years, he had learned that life often moved forward through moments people barely noticed at the time. A choice, a step, a second of instinct. Earlier that day, Max had made that choice without hesitation. Daniel set the mug down and walked toward the hallway, crouching beside the dog for a moment. He ran his hand gently across the golden fur, and Max lifted his head slightly, meeting his gaze with calm understanding before resting again near the door. Daniel looked toward Noah's room and then back at the dog. In a quiet voice, he said something he knew was true. Sometimes the ones who guard our lives do it without medals, without recognition, and without ever asking for thanks. They simply stay, close, watch carefully, and step forward when the moment arrives. In that quiet hallway beneath the Montana night, Max continued his silent watch while the little boy he had protected slept peacefully only a few feet away. The house grew completely quiet as the night settled fully across Cedar Falls, and the steady rhythm of the Montana countryside carried gently through the walls of the Brooks family home. In the hallway outside Noah's room, Max remained exactly where he had chosen to lie, His body stretched comfortably across the floor, while the soft glow of a nearby night light painted a faint circle of warmth against the wall. The small wooden door remained slightly open, just enough for the quiet breathing of a sleeping child to drift into the hallway. Inside the room, Noah slept peacefully beneath his blanket, unaware that the calm safety of the night had been protected by a silent decision earlier that afternoon. Down the hall, Daniel and Emily turned off the final lights in the living room before heading toward their bedroom. The day had been long, and the quiet house now felt like a gentle reward after everything that had happened. Before stepping into their room, Daniel paused once more in the hallway and looked down at Max. The golden retriever lifted his head slowly, his amber eyes reflecting the dim light for a moment before he relaxed again against the floor. Daniel crouched beside him and placed a hand gently along the dog's neck, feeling the calm warmth beneath the thick fur. He did not need to say much. Some moments were understood without many words. Max's tail moved once against the floor, as if acknowledging the quiet appreciation. Daniel stood again and glanced toward Noah's room, where the soft glow of the nightlight still shined beneath the doorframe. For a long moment, he simply listened to the peaceful silence of the house. The same silence that had been protected by a simple act of instinct. Earlier that day, a small pair of footsteps had wandered toward the lake without understanding the danger waiting beneath the grass. A quiet dog had noticed something no one else had seen. A gentle pull had happened at exactly the right moment. And because of that moment, the night now felt ordinary again. Daniel finally stepped into the bedroom, and the hallway lights dimmed even further, leaving only the soft nightlight near Noah's door and the faint silver glow of moonlight spilling through the windows. Max lowered his head back onto his paws and closed his eyes halfway, though his ears still twitched occasionally at the distant sounds of the house and the quiet wind outside. Beyond the walls, the lake rested beneath the wide Montana sky, its surface calm and undisturbed as the moon continued its slow journey across the night. Time moved forward quietly, the way it always does after moments that could have changed everything, but did not. Inside the Brooks family home, a little boy slept peacefully, his future still stretching ahead of him in ways he would not understand for many years. And just outside his door, the dog who had protected that future rested quietly, asking for nothing more than the simple chance to stay close and keep watch.